The phrase, constitutional crisis, isn't one Americans throw around lightly. It's a term reserved for moments when the very rules of the nation, the written and unwritten agreements that hold the republic together, are being tested or even broken. And right now, according to a former Trump White House attorney, that's exactly where we are. The United States, he says, is in the middle of a constitutional crisis, and the American public is being asked to decide what that really means and what happens next. To understand the gravity of this claim, we have to go back and look at what a constitutional crisis actually is. A constitutional crisis isn't just political chaos, partisanship, or a heated debate about policy. It is a moment when the constitutional order itself, the checks and balances, the separation of powers, and the rule of law, are not functioning as intended. It could be a president refusing to comply with a court order, a Congress overstepping its legal authority, or a Supreme Court making a ruling that one of the other branches simply ignores. When one branch of government defies another without resolution, the system stops working. That's why hearing a former Trump White House lawyer say that the U.S. is in such a moment right now should make everyone stop scrolling for just a second. This is about more than one man, more than one party. This is about whether the framework written in 1787 can still hold the weight of a divided and polarized 2025. To appreciate what's happening, we have to step back and look at recent history. Over the past several years, political tensions have been building like pressure in a sealed container. The Trump administration tested the limits of executive power in a way not seen in decades. Questions about whether a president could be indicted while in office, whether he could ignore congressional subpoenas, and whether he could use emergency powers to bypass Congress became front-page news. After Trump left office, many assumed that chapter was closed, but it turned out to be the opening act. The January 6th Capitol attack, an event that shook the world, raised unprecedented questions about accountability, presidential immunity, and the peaceful transfer of power. Multiple investigations, federal indictments, and state cases against the former president have brought those questions roaring back into public view. Now, as Trump mounts another run for the presidency, these legal battles are intersecting with the political process itself. In some states, lawsuits have been filed to keep his name off the ballot, citing Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which bars individuals who have engaged in insurrection from holding office. That legal fight is already moving through state courts, with appeals expected to go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. If the highest court in the land has to decide whether a major party's frontrunner is even allowed to run, that is the kind of moment that can put enormous strain on the system. What makes this even more complicated is that Americans themselves are deeply divided about what justice looks like in this moment. Polls show that large majorities of Republicans believe the prosecutions against Trump are politically motivated, while majorities of Democrats believe they are necessary to uphold the rule of law. The judiciary, normally the least political branch of government, has been dragged into the spotlight, with judges and prosecutors facing threats and harassment. Social media amplifies every twist and turn, creating a feedback loop where legal filings are dissected in real time by influencers and commentators, often before the public has the full context. This environment puts massive pressure on judges to rule quickly and carefully, and it raises the stakes for every decision. If a court rules in favor of Trump, one side will call it a victory for democracy. If it rules against him, the other side will call it a victory for accountability. In both scenarios, millions of Americans are primed to feel that the system is either working perfectly or completely broken. And that is where the idea of a constitutional crisis becomes real. When a significant portion of the population stops believing that the system is legitimate, you get a crisis of confidence that can destabilize everything. If the first paragraph laid out the storm clouds gathering, this next part is where we step into the eye of that storm. The legal system is now front and center, and it is carrying a weight perhaps heavier than at any point since Watergate, maybe even since the Civil War. The former Trump White House attorney who sounded the alarm about a constitutional crisis is not alone. Legal scholars, former judges, and constitutional experts have been warning that we are entering uncharted waters. One of the most pressing questions facing the courts is whether a former president can face criminal accountability for actions taken while in office. Traditionally, the Justice Department has operated under the belief that a sitting president cannot be criminally prosecuted, but there is far less consensus about what happens once that president leaves office. In Trump's case, federal prosecutors have brought multiple charges, including conspiracy to defraud the United States, obstruction of an official proceeding, and mishandling of classified documents. Each of these cases carries its own complex legal arguments and potential precedents. If Trump were to be convicted of any of these charges, the nation would face a truly unprecedented scenario. A major party candidate running for president, potentially from behind bars. That is not something the Constitution explicitly forbids, but it is something that would test the country's institutions in ways we've never seen before. The Supreme Court looms large over all of this. No matter what happens in the lower courts, many of these questions are likely to end up before the 9 justices. The court has already faced criticism for its decisions in recent years, some accusing it of being too activist, others accusing it of failing to protect fundamental rights. Its credibility has been questioned in a way that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. If the court ends up ruling on Trump's eligibility to appear on the ballot, or on the scope of presidential immunity, those rulings will carry massive political consequences. They won't just settle legal questions, they will likely shape the course of the 2024 election and perhaps the future of the presidency itself. Imagine a scenario where the Supreme Court rules 5-4 in a deeply divided decision, effectively determining whether millions of Americans can vote for the candidate of their choice. In such a polarized environment, half the country might see that ruling as a political attack rather than a neutral application of law. That is how constitutional crises deepen, when people stop accepting judicial decisions as legitimate and start viewing them as partisan weapons. Outside the courtroom, the political landscape is becoming more volatile by the day. Congress is split almost evenly between Democrats and Republicans, and partisan gridlock has become the norm. Efforts to pass meaningful legislation on issues like election security, voting rights, and campaign finance reform have largely stalled. State legislatures are stepping into the void, passing their own rules that sometimes directly contradict one another, creating a patchwork of election laws that confuse voters and sometimes lead to legal showdowns. The media environment makes this worse by turning every development into a breaking news event. Every indictment, every court date, every subpoena becomes a headline, and in the process, the public loses sight of the bigger picture. People are exhausted, angry, and increasingly willing to believe conspiracy theories that confirm their pre-existing views. This erosion of trust is exactly what makes a constitutional crisis dangerous. A constitution can only function if the people governed by it agree to play by its rules. If enough citizens decide those rules no longer apply, or that the rules are rigged, the system itself begins to fail. The former Trump White House lawyer's warning isn't just about the law. It's about the survival of a political order that depends on faith, patience, and the willingness of losers in an election to accept defeat peacefully. That is the fragile thread holding the United States together at this moment. And that brings us to the most important question of all: where does this end? If the United States truly is in the middle of a constitutional crisis, then the outcome will determine not just who wins the next election, but what kind of country exists after it. There are several possible scenarios, and each carries enormous implications. In one scenario, the legal system moves quickly, Trump's cases are resolved before the 2024 election, and the country has clarity going into November. If he is convicted and voters still choose to elect him, that would be a decision made with full knowledge, and would raise new questions about whether a convicted felon could serve as president. If he is acquitted or charges are dismissed, his supporters would claim vindication, while his opponents would have to decide whether to accept that outcome and move forward. Either way, the institutions would have spoken, and the system might emerge stronger for having faced the test. But there's another, more dangerous scenario. What if these cases drag on? What if appeals stretch out for months or years, and what if the election arrives before any final verdict is reached? Then the country could face the possibility of a president-elect standing trial or even serving time while in office, a situation that would throw the nation into untested legal waters and force Congress and the courts to make decisions on the fly. We also have to consider the possibility of widespread unrest. The January 6 attack showed that there are individuals and groups willing to use violence when they believe the system has betrayed them. If the perception of illegitimacy spreads, whether because of a court ruling, a ballot disqualification, or a contested election result, we could see more attempts to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. The military and law enforcement would be put in an incredibly difficult position, possibly having to enforce orders that a significant portion of the public does not accept. This is the nightmare scenario for constitutional scholars, a moment where the government's authority is openly challenged not just politically but physically, with real risks to public safety. On the other hand, it's also possible that Americans surprise themselves. There is a long history of this country coming back from the brink. The system has been tested before, during the Civil War, during Watergate, during Bush versus Gore in 2000, and each time, it has bent but not broken. Perhaps this moment, too, will pass with the Constitution intact and the nation stronger for having endured it. But that outcome isn't automatic. It will depend on millions of ordinary people deciding that the rule of law matters more than partisanship, that democracy matters more than winning at any cost. And that's where you come in. Because this isn't just a story about politicians, judges, and lawyers in Washington, D.C. It's about the American people, and whether they still believe in the idea of a shared set of rules. Watching this constitutional drama unfold isn't a spectator sport. The outcome will depend on how informed and engaged the public is. Will people show up to vote? Will they stay peaceful even when they're angry? Will they demand accountability from their leaders, regardless of party? These questions are bigger than any one man, even a former president. They are about the future of the republic itself. If we are indeed in a constitutional crisis, then the next months will determine whether the Constitution survives this test or whether it becomes just another piece of paper, ignored when inconvenient. The former Trump White House attorney who issued this warning wasn't trying to scare anyone for fun, he was trying to wake up a country that might be sleepwalking into disaster. So as you finish this video, take a moment to reflect on what this means for you, your family, and the generations that will inherit this nation. Because if there was ever a time to pay attention, to stay informed, and to stand up for the rule of law, that time is right now.